Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Pocket Theology. My name is Jaden and I'm here with our host Jason Miller. Pocket Theology is a casual discussion podcast rooted in the pursuit of everyday encouragement for the Christian. We don't take ourselves too seriously, we definitely have some fun, and we ultimately try to leave our viewers with a deeper desire to seek after the heart of God and be encouraged by the gospel of Jesus. With that said, we're so glad you're tuning in. Jason, how's it going, man?
My dude, it feels like it's been a while since we've sat at this table.
It always feels like that, but it's just because our recording times are so sporadic. Sometimes we're a little tired on a Thursday. You're like fresh off of like doing your sermon
and last week was a nutty week.
Yeah.
and as a whole, actually, the last year has been a nutty year.
But
Dude, so yeah, we just finished the Olympics.
yeah.
And
How was the closing ceremony?
I didn't
missed
watch it.
Oh, you
I
missed it.
saw. I watched a video of Tom Cruise rappelling, and they're like, Tom Cruise does this crazy stunt, and I'm like, he rappelled. Like, that's not that. I've rappelled.
Did he rappel down a skyscraper after having robbed it?
Maybe. I don't know. Well, and he did a free rappel, so he had no.
Sure.
Yeah, they made such a big deal about it. Maybe there was more to the stunt than I saw.
Whoopsies.
But what I saw.
Jaden, the consummate professional, not turning off his phone before the podcast.
That's all right. I need to turn mine down because I guarantee you I'll get a text as well. So they made this huge deal that Tom Cruise was going to do this huge stunt, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the video I saw of it was him rappelling from the top,
Mm-hmm.
but he's doing it's called an Australian style, which is face forward
Okay.
down,
Sure.
which is harder.
Yeah.
I've never done Australian, primarily because I just never had a desire to. But
Sure.
I've rappelled. Rappelling's not that big of a deal. It's not that hard.
Yeah.
It requires about this much skill and a whole lot of trust in a rope.
You know, sorry to speak of this. I've recently been rappelling because we did a rock wall at a family
Yeah.
camp, and I felt really good about myself. I climbed up, I rung the bell. I was like, "Yeah, I did something hard," only to be immediately followed by like a 6-year-old girl
Who did the same
who
thing?
did the exact same thing with maybe even more grace and skill than
And
I.
probably
so-
faster. Yeah. And you're like, I did it, but I have to carry a lot of weight. Okay, you want to hear fun? Well, it's kind of it's funny and terrifying rappelling story.
Sure.
Okay, so when I was in high school, our youth pastor used to take us rappelling at a place called Stonewall in San Diego. And we would go as a youth group, and it was maybe 50 to 75 feet. Actually, it's probably like 25 feet, but because in my head it was big, I'm pretty sure it was probably 50 feet.
Sure.
So he'd anchor it up, and the college students who were our youth group leaders would come, and there's a thing in rappelling. It's called belay. And
Yep. Belaying. Yep. Because
so belaying
that's
is
the person down
basi-
at the bottom, right?
Yeah, and essentially the purpose of the belay is that for something happens to you, you lose consciousness, you miss a step, you're tired,
Mhm.
you're afraid. A belay pulls on the rope and it moves on the figure eight, and that essentially tightens it so you can't move anywhere.
Mhm.
Okay. So one of the common jokes among the leaders was to belay somebody mid-climb and then tie them to a tree. So essentially you were stuck because you can't move down, right? and it happened to me one time.
Oh, no.
When I was a leader. They belayed me halfway through, and he tied it to a tree, and for like 5 minutes.
Yeah. Just enough to get your blood going a little bit.
Just enough to get you frustrated, and you're not even on the rock because you're angled out.
Right,
So
right.
there's nothing you can do.
Sure.
So there was one of our leaders. His sister was in high school. He was a college student. And when you're rappelling, the goal of rappelling is you have to trust, one, the rope,
Mm-hmm.
but two, you have to understand physics
Mhm.
or trust physics. You don't have to understand physics. You just have to trust physics.
Right.
And specifically is that you put the rope behind you, and whatever you let out, it doesn't require a lot of strength or force. It's just movement. But if you move the rope behind you, it stops you. And if you move it this way and let it out a little bit, so you can control your descent, right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, so one of the first things they tell you is the lip is the scariest part. And the reason why the lip is the scariest part, it's because you don't just step off. You actually have to lean back over the cliff
Yeah.
and then walk down.
Right.
Okay. So when you're inexperienced, everything inside of you goes, this isn't normal.
No.
Right?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing they tell you is, okay, when you do this, You got to put your hand back. You need to trust the rope. You need to trust that the harness is strong enough. You'll be fine. And you will.
Yeah.
I mean, there's literally nothing to it except your brain.
Right.
And so the first thing they say is everything inside of you is going to want to grab the rope forward because you feel like that's going to control you, and you will slide straight down.
Yep.
So his sister, and I won't say her name because I don't have permission, but his sister, who I think is a junior at this time, she starts to go over. Well, she doesn't move her feet at the same time and ends up upside down.
Oh, no.
And she's hanging upside down, and her brother is belaying her. And he belays her and just stops her. So she's hanging upside down. And unless you're an experienced rappeller, it's hard to know how to right yourself.
Yes.
And so she's freaking out. And
No
he is
kidding.
laughing hysterically.
As brothers do.
Yeah, and he's got her belayed. Nothing's going to happen to her, but she's literally hanging upside down.
Yeah.
Looking down a 50-foot, 30-foot, however long the distance is.
Which in that scenario, in her mind, may as well be 1,000 feet.
Well, yeah, because if she did fall, that would be the end, right?
Yeah. Wow.
But I still remember that scene because there were a couple things that took place in it, and our youth pastor used it as a tool to talk about faith.
Sure.
And
as pastors do, turn trauma into teaching.
I still use this story as an example of faith. And he said, here's the thing with faith, is that faith is you have to trust somebody that's not you. It's totally out of your control. That's what faith is.
Yeah.
But it's not a blind faith. It's a reasonable faith.
Sure.
But the hardest part about faith is that we're the ones who determine what's reasonable.
Sure.
Right? And that's what makes it difficult is we go, well, I'm the one who determines it's reasonable, when in reality, God says, no, your first act of faith is to trust that I'm the one who determines what's a reasonable faith.
We define the limitations of faith where he's actually given us more.
Yeah. And as a result of that, we end up upside down in our faith at times because instead of trusting that the person who actually knows what they're doing, trusting that the belayer's got you, we take things into our own matters because we put more faith in ourselves than the things that we may not be able to see or control.
Now that is a really good illustration,
isn't it? And also it's a whole thing about like what happens when you get ahead of yourself.
Yeah.
What happens when you get ahead of God is that, and then you blame God when things go sideways. Well, it's no, you got ahead of God or you went someplace that God didn't tell you to go.
Sure.
Right. So anyway, so that had nothing. This has nothing to do with what we're going to talk about today. But I watched
a fun little anecdote, nonetheless.
It is a rabbit trail. Look, a squirrel.
Yeah, we were good at those.
I know. We never rabbit trail.
Well, actually, sorry, I'm going to rabbit trail on us real fast one more time. But actually, a lot of compliments recently from people. So thanks so much for watching. A lot of people are really liking the podcast.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, we're coming up on 50 episodes. I mean, that's kind of cool.
The new format.
I think we've passed its birthday.
Probably.
Yeah, we've been doing this for a year, so.
That's amazing, in the new format.
In the new format, yes.
That's awesome.
Yeah, man.
Well, hey, thank you to all those who've been watching and who are supporting, and continue to forward it to friends.
Yeah.
And we love the feedback and we love the questions. So anyways, I watched Tom Cruise, and they made this big deal about this dangerous stunt. Not that dangerous.
Sure.
Now, it's scary because that's like if you don't understand, but Tom Cruise, it was probably the least scary stunt he's ever done.
Yeah.
Did you hear for the latest Mission Impossible? He spent like, I don't know how long planning. It's a stunt that literally could have killed him. It was the one, did you see the movie, the newest one? Okay, so there's a scene where he's on a motorcycle and he launches the motorcycle off a cliff onto a paraglide. So he launches a parachute.
Sure.
And that was a real thing. Like he did that.
So the motorcycle goes off the cliff. He ditches the motorcycle and he gets
midair,
into a
and then he pulls a parachute.
That's kind of cool.
And apparently there's all these things that can go wrong. But anyways, so yeah, that was the end of the Olympic ceremony. Another thing to talk about on Olympics. So it's interesting. So we're going to talk about two primary things today, and they're kind of connected. And kind of not, but they still have to do with us. Actually, they're actually pretty connected.
Sure.
First one is, again, I know we've talked about this a lot because we're coming into a political year or a cycle in the next couple months. With that, you have a lot of Christians that are really nervous right now about the future of Christianity, the future of America, Christianity in America, the church. All kinds of things about the Antichrist and Revelation and that kind of
Yada,
stuff.
yada,
And
yada.
just a little preview, and we're giving a sneak peek here, but we're actually going to be doing an entire series on the book of Revelation starting in October.
Nice.
But it's not going to be what people are expecting.
Right.
But I'm really looking forward to it. And it's intentional. My wife actually said, "Are you sure you want to do that right as we're coming into election?" I'm like, that's why I feel called to do it.
Wow. Yeah.
Is much like the heaven and hell and everything in between.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting. This is how I kind of get a read that I'm listening to the Spirit, that this isn't just Jason going, I have an idea.
Sure.
It's all of a sudden we're finding books. Well-known pastors are coming out with books on the book of Revelation.
And in our own community, I know there's a group of ladies that are currently working through the book. So
Yeah.
it's like something that's even on the community of Zion's heart, too.
And so that's when, and that was the same thing with the Heaven and Hell series. So we
Mhm.
did the Heaven and Hell and everything in between. And it was crazy. All of a sudden, like, books are coming out on Heaven and Hell and
Yeah.
other churches. And that doesn't, what that tells me is that we're listening.
Yeah.
We're paying attention to where the Spirit is moving. And I'm actually excited for this, because I think so many people are afraid of the end times. I know people who won't even read the book of Revelation because it freaks them
Yeah,
out so
that's what I
much.
was about to say. I was like, some people don't even want to touch the book.
Oh, they're terrified of it, and understandably,
Mm.
because there's a lot of weirdness in it.
Yeah.
It's weird.
It's already, Bible's already complicated to understand. Now you're telling me there's going to be seals and dragons and
Not seals,
what?
not like seals.
Seals.
Sorry, I don't know why I needed to do the visual
The
with that.
correction, I mean, it's a weird book. Maybe there will
seals,
be seals.
Maybe that's what it actually meant when it talks about the seals. Maybe it
seven
actually was
seals.
like not seals of scrolls,
Yeah.
but seals on scrolls. Like,
Whoa.
yeah, we're just blowing everybody's mind.
Dude.
But going back to the Olympics,
Yeah.
so today we're going to be talking a little bit about what happens in times of crisis and how do we be good friends. Now, as a community, we just went through a pretty difficult trauma in a small town.
Mm-hmm.
Tragically lost a student, a young girl, to a car accident. And the pastor who did the service, that family goes to his church, is a
Mhm.
good friend of mine. And in moments like that, like, these are hard moments.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when you're in a smaller community, because everybody's impacted by them to
Mhm.
some degree.
Yeah.
So we're going to look at the book of Job and Job's friends. But then also, I want to take a little bit of a pivot and talk about how are we as Christians supposed to respond in times of crisis or in times of what feels like persecution or hardship.
Mm.
And this connects to actually what I preached on Sunday, which was talking all about how we leverage our resources, and that God has given us tons of resources, but if a resource isn't being used, it's essentially a wasted resource. What God wants us to see is that our resources are assets, and an asset is a resource in action, right? All right, so let's talk about Job's friends first.
Okay.
And this is partly because of, I know personally, I know several people that are going through difficult times. I have friends who are going through divorces right now.
Mm.
I have friends who are battling cancer right now. I have friends who are dealing with the loss of a loved one or trying to process through things.
Mm-hmm.
The book of Job is interesting. I don't know if you've ever read the book of Job.
Mm-hmm.
There's some scholarly debate on the purpose of Job.
Mm.
And I'll say that I don't really know. One of the things around Job is some scholars believe that Job it didn't actually happen.
Sure.
Rather that it's a fable or a story that is meant to convey something. Other people will say that no, Job is a historical fact. And I don't think it really matters. Whether or not Job is historical or Job is a story that is in the Bible, stories convey truth for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
We don't dismiss the parables of Jesus.
Right, simply because they're stories.
Simply because they're parables.
Yeah.
And I think for some people, the fear around whether or not Job is literal is, well, then how do we know what is and what isn't literal in the Bible, or what is real? And that's a fair question.
Yeah.
Right? Because if somebody's like, well, if Job is a parable, maybe Jesus is a parable too. And the problem with that is
it's like a slippery slope real fast.
Well, unless you understand the Bible, unless
Sure.
you understand the historical reference and the genre,
Yeah.
right? Job is written specifically in a poetic narrative. So there's a lot of poetry in Job, and yes, there's story, but also historically, the purpose of Job isn't salvation. It is really how are we to understand suffering in this world?
Mm-hmm.
And so this is where the tie is going to come into our rights and how we are to handle difficult things, right? So there's this opening scene in the book of Job, and one of the things we do know is that Job is one of the oldest known books in the Bible,
Mm.
um, and at the center of it is suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And Job is a righteous man, and you have this weird scene that plays out in heaven
Mm-hmm.
where angels and Satan, the
Mm-hmm.
devil, are in this courtroom with God, and it says that the devil he had just finished roaming the earth,
Mm-hmm.
and he basically just goes to God and says, "Hey, this guy Job.
Mm-hmm.
The only reason why he loves you is because you've blessed him and given him so much. I mean, he's wealthy, he's got great kids, he's got a great family, a lot of sheep, a lot of houses, right?" And there's this interesting phrase in there and I don't know, I'm not a Hebrew scholar, and so I don't know how truth this is, but one of my professors in school
Mm-hmm.
raised an interesting question. There's a quote or a question there in which God turns to Satan and says, "Have you been considering my servant Job?" And some people think it's basically God saying, "Hey, have you? Let me throw Job at you. You want to talk about why somebody follows me?" Because Satan's like, "Well, the only reason why he follows you is because you've blessed him."
Mm.
And so, in one sense, you get this idea that God offers up Job as like a sacrifice to
Sure.
Satan to prove to win a bet, so to speak. That's how it feels.
Sure.
That's not what's going on, but that's how it feels. And one of my professors raised an interesting question. He goes, "But what if the question he was asking was not, 'Hey, look at my servant Job. I'll
Mm-hmm.
prove my point.' What if it's, 'You've been looking at my servant Job, haven't you?'"
Mm-hmm.
One is God putting Job in front of Satan. The other one is God recognizing that Satan's already been considering Job, and God is just simply calling out what's happening there. God gives Satan permission to mess with Job. Not because Job's done anything wrong, but simply because Satan has said, "Well, the only reason why this guy follows you is because you blessed him."
Mm.
Now, again, this feels very odd. Another interesting fact is that when we hear the word Satan, the actual word is Hasatan,
Yeah. It just
which
means the
it
adversary,
means
right?
adversary. That's it. It doesn't actually mean, it may not actually be the devil as we think of.
Could it be an angel playing devil's advocate?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, I don't know.
Just
I know that I know that there are some who are like, when we say it's the devil, that may not actually be who it is. It
sure.
could be an angel or a spiritual entity.
Because there are people who are curious about Job who actually like that becomes like a stumbling block for them in conversations I have about Job
Mhm.
is like why was Satan one even there? Why was God like even paying him any mind or like it becomes like a stumbling block for people, but then that's where knowing some of the languages is helpful.
And even understanding some Hebrew theology. So there's a guy named Michael Heiser who died a couple years ago from pancreatic cancer. Actually, I think he died just last year. Um, there's this divine council and courtroom, and there's all kinds of things that we don't understand.
Sure.
But also, if this is a fable, if it's not an actual story, that doesn't mean there's a theology there.
Yeah.
It's not about that. It's just he's setting up the
It is
story,
setting up the story.
right? And
Yeah.
that's why some people think it's a fable.
Sure.
Is that this is a story meant to convey a truth, particularly about the issue of theodicy or where is God in suffering.
Cool.
Um, okay, so what you see is God gives Satan permission to mess with Job, and the first thing he says is, "You can take away his kids, you can take away his money, but you can't harm Job. Do whatever you want to his family, but you can't hurt him." And so all of his kids die. All of his sheep are stolen. Like all this stuff, everything burns down. His whole life is a wasteland, but Job is physically healthy. And it says that Job still praises God.
Yeah.
So Satan comes back to God and says, "Well, the only reason why I did that is because he's fine. But if I hurt him," and he goes, "Well, tell you what, you can hurt Job now, but you can't kill him. So you can do anything you want to his body, you just can't die."
Mm.
And you see this scene where Job now he's got boils all over his body. His family's gone, dead, not left, dead.
Nope, gone.
And God allowed this. And there's a moment in there where it says that Job's friends, he had 3 friends who sat with him for 7 days,
Mm-hmm.
and they just wept with him.
Mm.
They were really good friends. And then they started talking. And these 3 friends immediately, and this is what we do as Christians, we see this all the time. They're first just sitting, the ministry of presence. They see their friend hurting, they see their friend going through a lot, and they don't try and fix the problem. They just sit with them. And in that, like, man, those are good friends. When I do funerals, one of the things that I now do this as part of my message because I do it to care for those who are grieving.
Mm.
The number of times that people try to say things to bring comfort that just make it worse.
Yeah.
So, like an example, the number of times I've heard people say things like, well, God just needed them up in heaven more than you needed him down here. That is a cruel God, but God doesn't need anything.
Right.
He's God.
Yeah.
But let's think about what you just said to them. God is so selfish that he took that child, that parent, that friend, because he needed them more up in heaven. That's not the God we see in Scripture.
No.
Or how about this one? Well, God needed another angel up in heaven. Nope, humans don't become angels.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a thing. Or the other one was God wanted to pick that beautiful flower
Sure.
so that he could enjoy it. Again, these all make God seem cruel, and they're all coming from an intention of
Mm-hmm.
trying to be helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? They're coming from a place of, I see you hurting, I don't know what to do, I want to make you feel
I
better.
just want to say something kind. Or,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or something that might bring any kind of relief or comfort, and none of those offer comfort. In
Mm-mm.
fact, they cause more pain because now
Sure.
you're like, no, the best place for my child to be is with me.
Yeah.
And yes, that child is, if they love Jesus, they're with Jesus and praise the Lord. But no.
It's an interesting balance of, like, as Christians we have a hope, right, that no other people have, but that hope, while being a long-term sustainable form of comfort, isn't an immediate one.
Yeah.
And so when we try to use it as such, you're right, it kind of just comes off as a little bit of a spit. I think it just takes time for us to understand that.
Well, and we've also not been taught this.
Yeah.
We've not taught how to come up beside people in grieving. And this is where Job is an interesting story because his friends at first are great friends.
Yeah.
They don't try and fix anything. They don't try and bring words of comfort. They're just present.
Yeah.
And here's the first thing we see, and this is the first challenge that I think in times of hurt or crisis or turmoil, if you see somebody who is struggling or going through something traumatic, the best thing you can do is just to be there.
Yeah.
And talk. Don't try and comfort. Don't try and give them words of wisdom or to make it better. Just, hey, how are you doing? I love you. If you need to talk, I'm here. If you don't, if you just want to sit in silence together, we can do that, right? And then they talk.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately, and this is what humans do, whenever we see suffering, it's reasonable. And there's a reason why I say this is reasonable. A lot of times we'll make an assumption that the reason why suffering is happening is because we've probably done something to deserve it.
Yeah, I see where you're at.
Right? Okay. And there's a reason why, because we look at bad things and we go, well, maybe they must have done something that caused this, right? And here's the story with Job. Nobody knows the backstory. Job doesn't even know the backstory. He doesn't know what's going on in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And Job has done nothing.
Yeah, he thinks he's been faithful. He thinks he's been a good steward. He thinks he's done.
Well,
all
he
this.
has been.
Yeah.
He doesn't even think.
Yeah.
He has been a faithful steward. He has
Sure.
been good.
Yeah.
And so his friends immediately come and they're so, well, Job, obviously you've done something. You need to repent because no one would suffer unjustly. No one should suffer unless they've done something wrong. And Job comes in, he's like, listen, I don't know what I've done. I can't think of anything that would deserve this. And the first friend actually says things like, well, the Lord is disciplined. The Lord disciplines people. And I've heard people in times of crisis when people will say stuff like that. I remember there was a season I was struggling with insomnia.
Sure.
And I went to my pastor and said, I've really been struggling with sleep. And he then quoted a proverb to me that was talking about how the wicked don't sleep.
Mm.
And he goes, well, Jason, you probably have unconfessed sin. I don't think so.
Mm.
I just couldn't sleep. And immediately it was, well, there's a reason why. And he took scripture And instead of asking a question, he assumed, well, the reason why you got insomnia is because this verse and this thing says that the wicked struggle with sleep.
Sure.
And I was like, wait, no, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Like genuinely. And the things I have sinned, I've confessed. So I don't think that's it.
Right.
And so Job actually comes in and he begins to defend himself. And he's like, if I've done anything, I don't know what it is. I can't fathom it. And here again, if we look back in the story of Job, well, we soon discover Job did nothing
Right.
other than pique the interest of Satan,
Sure.
and God allowed it, right?
Sure.
Okay, now there's a whole range of things around suffering about why does God allow that? What's the purpose? And that's a different podcast.
Yep.
What I wanted to talk about first today is when we see people going through difficult things, sometimes the best thing we can do is just be present. Don't try and bring human comfort, especially in times when you've lost somebody you love.
Yeah.
Because there's no sermon. Pastor Adam, yesterday at the funeral for this girl, was so wise and caring. And he started off by saying, "You owe the people here nothing." And I sat there and I was like, man, what a wise word. And he said, "We're here for you. You don't need to," because everybody wants to hug, everybody wants to talk to you, everybody wants to try and show their support. And if what you need is just to be alone or to leave, you have our permission to not be here because we're here in this moment with you. You don't owe us anything. And I heard that and I went, man, what a great word when we're going through grief, when we're going through a hard time. Because sometimes when we're going through difficult times, we feel like we owe other people. I walked with somebody who lost their husband to cancer, and I said, here's the thing. All these well-intentioned people, they're going to want you to stand in line for sometimes 45 minutes to an hour and really to comfort them. And you're the one who's going through the most grief.
Yeah, it is kind of weird. Sometimes I feel like sometimes empathy gets a little twisted in grief, where we, as the people who are outside of the process, try to bring comfort to ourselves by, um, like interjecting or including ourselves into the trauma. Where really all that it's kind of like, yep, I did my good thing,
Yeah.
or yep, I made sure I said something. Where were they in that statement?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
And I catch myself doing that a lot. I
Yeah.
mean, and it's not that you're like with the comments that we talked about being a little problematic. It's all good intentioned, right? Like you're trying to be kind and show love, but yeah, you're right. What is better?
Sometimes and there is a holiness
Mm-hmm.
in presence.
Yeah.
And we see this with the ministry of Jesus. And sometimes the best thing you can do is just simply say, "I'm sorry and I love you."
Yeah.
And do you need a hug?
Yeah.
Right? And sometimes, and so, Lisa's mom died from cancer. It'll be, 9 years this October. So in a couple months. Can't
Sure.
believe it's been 9 years. Um, and I remember at the funeral, we were standing in line and all the people that were coming to give us hugs, it felt like more we were there to comfort them than they were to comfort us, even though all of them were good intention. They were trying to offer.
Yeah.
But here you are, you're already emotionally exhausted, and now you got to stand in line.
Yeah, no kidding. I've always found that so odd. I really have. At any visitation I've ever been to, family or otherwise, I think it's so weird that part of this grieving process is me having to be available for everyone else.
Yeah. So interesting. The Jews have this thing called Shiva. It's called sitting
I've
Shiva.
heard of this.
Right.
Yeah.
And I actually think there's a beauty in the way they do it that's different than ours because we block everything into a 2 or 3 hour thing.
Yeah.
Right. And that's exhausting. So to sit Shiva when somebody you love has died, you go into a period of mourning where you basically sit. So you're not standing and people will come, but it's basically almost like a party's too strong of a word. There's meals and everybody's in the house, but your only responsibility is just to be there to grieve.
Mm.
And they're there to comfort you.
Mm.
And sometimes they'll come by and talk to you, but the idea is sitting Shiva is to allow proper time to grieve and mourn. And when difficult times happen, I think sometimes we just want to move in and out because there's an uncomfortableness that comes with grieving.
Well, there was a really important word that was given to me, speaking of pastors at funerals, when my sister-in-law passed away. The pastor said,
it was my brother. He said, once today passes and today's grieving process is over, please don't forget Matthew. Like, don't let it just be today and pass and done.
Yeah.
Like, keep checking in on him and um keep him in mind. And so I like that. I feel like, yeah, you're right. We want it to just be quick, over and done, and the grieving process is done.
Yeah.
But it's not for that individual.
And in fairness, life goes on. That's the
Yeah.
one thing that you'll discover about anything that's hard.
Mm-hmm.
Life moves on.
Life goes on, but it goes on a lot slower for that person.
Well, and I would say for that person, sometimes it doesn't feel like life goes on, but for the rest of the world, it keeps on spinning.
Yeah.
And that's the hardest part is, again, you'll see the after the effect, and depending on what happened, it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the book of Job is so important for us. Job is what allows us. It confronts the issue of suffering
Mm-hmm.
head on.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why it's included. It's included as part of what's called the wisdom literature.
Yep.
And so as we read it with the lens of, okay, first of all, sometimes bad things happen not because you've done anything wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes bad things are the consequence of bad decisions.
Mm-hmm.
We should never assume that if somebody is dealing with something or life is hard, it's because they've done something wrong. No, it's because we live in a broken world.
Mm-hmm.
There is an element in there in which we can look and say the other side is there is an enemy.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't understand God's wisdom and plans. Personally, I lean the book of Job is more of a story than it is real life.
Sure.
Because I think it's meant to convey something. But it could be. I could get to heaven and Job might be there, and I'll be like, hey, high five, right? That's awesome.
Do you just need a hug?
Do you just need, yeah. Well, not anymore.
No, he's good.
All right, so that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. And this kind of leads into the second part. So, we've been talking about this approach to devotions that I've been doing my time with the Lord.
Yeah.
That I've been approaching it a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still going well in the sense that I'm reading just to be present with the Lord.
Yeah.
And if something stands out, great. And if it doesn't, that's okay. I spend time with the Lord. So I just finished the book of Acts, and I'm in chapter 5 or 7 of Job right now. And I just finished Acts as well today. The book of Acts ends with Paul basically awaiting in prison, and then we know eventually he's going to die in Rome. Okay. And there's this interesting scene in the last several chapters of Acts where basically what happens is Paul is preaching. There's a group of Jews who don't like what Paul is preaching, so they try and get the local magistrate to execute Paul.
Mm.
And they bring him before him, and the magistrate's like, listen, this guy's done nothing by our laws, by Roman laws that demand that he be killed. I have to let him go. And Paul then says this. He goes, well, you know what? I don't want that. I want to go to trial.
Mm.
So he's basically, Paul's gotten out, and Paul's like, no, because his heart is to share the gospel, right?
Yeah.
So Paul could have been released from prison,
Mm-hmm.
but because his ultimate goal is to preach the gospel, he forgoes his rights. And in fact, the right he chooses is he says, I'm a Roman citizen, and as a Roman citizen, I have the right to be heard by the Roman government and ultimately by Caesar himself, by the emperor, like if that has to go that far.
Wow.
And so Paul forgoes his rights of freedom to stay in prison so he can share the gospel. And every time he goes up, he keeps on going up the level, right?
Yeah.
And each time he's going up, they're like, well, I should let you go. The Roman government's like, we should let you go. You've done nothing wrong. Well, no, I'm a Roman citizen. I have the right to ask for a trial. And the book of Acts ends with Paul in house arrest where he's got a Roman guard guarding him. And he's basically he's going to have the opportunity to preach the gospel on the largest scale possible, right? And this got me thinking, and again, this goes back to, in a weird, this is on my mind, monkey mind, right?
Monkey brain.
As I was thinking through Job and grief and the things that are going through, someone could have looked at Paul and said, well, Paul, you're obviously in this because you did something wrong. You're in a hard situation, and yet we know Paul chose to be there.
Mm-hmm.
We also know that later on in several of the epistles that he writes, he actually talks about the joy he considers it to be in prison for the gospel.
Mm.
Hardships are a guarantee. Now, as
Mhm.
Americans, we struggle with hardships. Okay, now this is where it's going to take an interesting turn. So I was following on Facebook, and here's this guy, Gabriel Medina.
Okay.
Okay, now everybody's like, Jason, where are you going with this? He's a surfer.
Okay.
From Paul to surfing. That's where we're
From
going.
Paul to surfing.
Listen to this. He's a Brazilian surfer. Gabriel Medina was forced to remove an image of Jesus from his surfboard during the Paris Olympics, or he risked being disqualified.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the guy had an image of Jesus on his surfboard, and they basically said, you have to remove this or you're DQ'd. You're out of the Olympics. Now, as an American, now he's Brazilian. As Americans, be like, but this is my right. It's my right. And now we look at that as he's being persecuted.
Right.
Persecuted for his faith because he wants an image of Jesus. So he took it off.
Oh, did he?
He took it off. Now, check this out. He then scored a near perfect 9.90 wave on day 3 of the surfing competition in Tahiti, the highest score in Olympic history.
Wow.
Okay. Now, here's the coolest part. Photographer Jerome Brulette captured the iconic moment. And here's this moment of Medina as he's finishing his ride. He's on his surfboard. The surfboard's next to him. And I don't know. I almost want to show it on there, but I wonder.
Send me the image and I'll put it up on the screen and maybe
Awesome.
we'll include a link in the short so that people who are just listening can find it.
So there's this sweet scene, and I saw this all over, and I didn't know the backstory. I just thought, what a cool surfing moment, right? So he launches his board up in the air. He's finished with the wave, and he's literally standing perfectly above the water, and all he's doing is pointing to the Lord.
Dude, that's cool.
And it made national news. Okay, so now here's where my monkey mind goes. Because this is how my brain works.
Yeah.
He could have made a big stink
Yeah.
about, no, my right is to have Jesus on my surfboard. How dare you? This is my faith. I don't want to do this. He could have. And many Christians would have said, you need to fight for this.
Yeah.
You need to fight for the right to speak up, and who cares? It's your faith. No one can tell you what to believe.
Sure.
Instead, he said, okay, I'll surf a different board.
Sure.
And now he goes on to score the greatest score in Olympic history for surfing. High score, 9.9 out of 10. And then there's this iconic photo of him surfing where he's pointing to the Lord.
Yeah.
Okay, now here's the question. By giving up his right to fight over an image, did he have a greater impact by giving up his right, or would he have had a greater impact by fighting for his right to have that image?
Yeah, for sure.
And here's where I think this ties for me, okay? One group of people would have absolutely applauded him for standing up. And if he had been persecuted, had been suffering, we would have said, well, he was suffering for the Lord.
Yeah.
And if he was DQ'd, there would have been rallies, unfair. He was DQ'd because he loved Jesus. And I think he saw the greater picture.
Yeah.
And instead of seeing the suffering as an attack on him, he saw it as an opportunity.
Yeah.
And this opportunity allowed him a greater influence, a greater witness.
Sure.
And now he's got this image, this iconic image that is crazy. I'll send it to you. It is the coolest photo. I remember the first time I saw it, I went, that is an awesome photo.
Cool.
But now his story is going around and people are hearing. One, now people know he loves Jesus and he's not the guy who fought the Olympics. He's the guy who basically just said, okay, I'm not going to fight over this small thing. But now he has this greater influence.
Yeah.
Paul, the Apostle Paul, he foregoed his rights and could have said, I'm innocent, let me go.
Yeah.
And instead kept on defending himself to share the gospel wherever he could.
Yeah.
As an opportunity. Now, here's where this ties to Job for me. Okay, Job, we're talking about suffering, and there are two parts of things. When somebody's really going through something hard, the best thing you can do is just to be there as a friend, to sit with them, to love them. Don't try and fix it. Don't try and correct them. Don't try and give them reasons to make it better or explain it. Just be present. But there's another side to Job as well, which is suffering is part of this world.
Yeah.
And if you don't come to grips with suffering as a Christian, you might miss opportunities that God places in front of you.
Yeah.
Do you see the connection that I'm making?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so that's a little bit of a stretch, but this is how my mind works.
No, and I made a little bit of a different connection.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit more of a simplistic one, but I just like how in all of them they're taking moments of adversity. They're taking moments of trial or just tribulation or whatever, and they're using them as an opportunity to continually show God's faithfulness in their lives and their trust in Him, like we were talking about the belay, right? You have to,
Yep.
and things like that. Like they trusted that God was bigger than their suffering or their persecution or their hardship, and they knew that in that God was going to do something bigger than that. And I like that the human approach, you're right, would have been to be all like angry about it, and in any scenario, right? Paul could have been angry, Job could have been angry, Medina could have been angry, but no, they said, okay, that's fine. God's going to do something better with this.
And my job is to be faithful in it.
Yes, exactly.
That's all my job is. Okay, so this past Sunday, I talked all about resources and the difference between a resource and an asset.
Yeah.
Resource is a surfing for him.
Yeah. The world stage was a resource for him.
That's right.
And he was at the Olympics.
An asset is when you put a resource into action.
Yeah.
So just because you do something, if you don't use it as an asset for the kingdom, an asset can become an idol real quick.
Yeah.
Right? And so here we have this beautiful moment, and to your point, okay, so this is from James chapter 1. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't say if.
Yeah. Yep.
You're going to face trials
Yeah.
of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because of the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. The person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do. It's interesting is that in James, he's actually saying, he's preparing us. You're going to have trials.
Mm-hmm.
How you handle the trial is what determines not just your maturity, but your maturing.
Yeah. Yeah, I think of that moment you said is the double-mindedness, right?
Yeah.
He could have idolized his rights,
Could have.
right?
Absolutely.
And I think that's what maybe would have been more shown.
And maybe because he's not an American, maybe in Brazil,
Yeah.
they're not as obsessed with rights because we live in a democratic culture where here we're all about our rights.
Yep.
And so maybe that benefited him.
I think that is true, a cultural aspect that could have helped him in that scenario.
Because I think we assume that everybody thinks like Americans.
Oh yeah. No, but absolutely, and it is kind of important that I'm not shocked that occurred, because here we're all about free speech. You can have whatever you want on a T-shirt, and it's fine. That is not the case everywhere else.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised he was asked to take something like that down.
Yeah, and for me, I'm like, okay, and
Sure.
and he didn't. Now maybe he petitioned. We don't get the sense that he did.
Sure.
And so here we look at this, and Romans talks about this as well. Is that we're going to suffer. We're going to have hardships happen.
Yeah.
But these hardships happen for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's go back to the book of Job. This is where it all ties in.
Yep.
Sometimes I do think the enemy is at work and just wants to mess with you.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I do think the Lord allows difficulty because it is to mature you. The purpose of discipline and wrath are not the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
So when we make an assumption that if somebody is being punished because of sin, well, I think we usually think of wrath, because the purpose of discipline is to help somebody grow.
I also just think like there is part of it that's just an intangible, just consequence of itself. Like there isn't always it isn't always Satan's hand. It isn't always God's hand. Sometimes it's just you made a dumb choice, and there's dumb things that happen with dumb choices.
We cannot blame God for our decisions. The number of people and I've done this where I'll do something stupid and then I get upset with God because of the consequence.
Yeah.
It's like not studying for a test, and then when I get an F, go, I don't know if God's real. Why don't you?
Or just being like not studying for a test, failing the test, and blaming the teacher. Just doesn't make sense.
Oh yeah, and that's exactly the point. Is that I think sometimes when we come into difficult times, and we're coming into, again, this is what happens every election year. I was just having this conversation this morning with my buddy that I work out with. We are such a divided culture, and we
Yeah.
have been for the last 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this tremendous fear in the church, particularly about, well, what happens if this person becomes president? Or what happens if this happens? What happens if this happens? And the Bible is a reminder, and this is why we need the history. Now, it's helpful to remember that the Bible is written over a span of about 1,500 years.
Yeah.
America hasn't even been around for 1,500 years. We've existed as the great experiment for a few hundred years.
Yeah.
And the church has been around for 2,000 years, but
Yeah.
we've existed through inquisitions.
Yeah.
It's been all over the world.
Yeah. Well, I even just think of, I think understanding church history and getting back to our roots is kind of an important thing. If we're afraid of persecution in this upcoming season, or we're afraid of what happens if this legislation gets passed or whatever, one part of my mind, I'm not saying I'm not considering those things, but one part of my mind does go to the early church.
Yeah.
Where they were literally hiding in homes because there was risk of not just persecution, death.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so I think if they had a faith that was so strong to trust God in the midst of I mean risking their lives,
Yeah.
I think that there is something that we've lost in some capacity if we're so afraid of
Oh, yeah.
of law. We're afraid of the world's law?
Yeah.
What?
Well, okay. So you know the movie WALL-E?
Yeah. Oh
Okay.
yeah, I love that movie.
Okay, so there's this. Why did all the humans get fat and gross and couldn't walk?
It's because like they developed technology and the robots and stuff.
Yeah, they
did
basically
everything
didn't
for
have to
'em.
do anything. There was no struggle.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There was no struggle. There was abundance, right?
There was abundance, and eventually, if you have all you have is abundance, and you have
Mhm.
no struggle, you have nothing to push against you, you actually get weaker. Okay, so
Yeah.
if we look at church history, when the church is the strongest is in times of persecution.
Yeah. But it's because they had faith. It's because they had each other and they banded together. They weren't divided.
That's the Acts chapter 2. They were
Yeah.
in community. They
Yeah.
found community, and because America, even at our worst day, America Christianity, we are still so blessed compared to most of the world.
Sure.
And that doesn't mean I'm like inviting persecution. Please
Yeah.
don't think I'm saying that. I praise God
Yeah.
for that we live in the United States. I praise God that we have the freedoms that we do.
You're saying we're pretty comfortable. Don't let that make us weak.
And in fact, that's the problem is that when you become comfortable,
Yeah.
you end up like WALL-E. You end up you forget that the way you build muscle is through opposition. The way
Yeah.
you get stronger is through opposition. The way they did an experiment, and I don't even know if this is true or if it's just an anecdotal thing, but the story goes that they had a biodome and they put some trees in this biodome, and they made an assumption that this trees in the biodome, if they had the perfect environment, perfect amount of water, perfect sunlight, perfect everything, that they would be grounded and rooted stronger
Yeah.
than a tree in nature. They then removed the biodome, and the first wind that came along knocked the trees right over, because what secures the roots of the tree is adversity.
In rough soil.
That's right.
Did you ever hear of the utopian rat colonies?
Sounds
Experiments?
familiar. Say more.
So there's this experiment where they had 2 rat colonies, and one, they gave them all the cheese they needed. It was a comfortable environment. The other, it was just like a box, right? It was just natural habitat. And every single time they ran this experiment, the utopian mouse colony died.
Yeah.
Extinction, like wiped out, because they overpopulated. They went crazy because they had nothing to push against. They just started eating each other.
Yeah.
I mean, they went nuts. So you're right. I mean, we need adversity.
And this is the point where when we have adversity, and let's bring it all back now. When we're facing adversity,
Mm-hmm.
adversity shows your maturity, but also helps you in your maturity.
Yeah.
And so when somebody who immediately, and I see this more often than I think is I'd like, but the number of people I know who become Christians, and then the minute something goes wrong in their life, they're just like, well, obviously God's not real, because I assume that if I love Jesus, everything would be fine.
Sure.
And I see this all the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in prosperity gospel is a big deal, right? Like, you got faith, you've got it,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and it's also Dietrich Bonhoeffer, if you're not
Mhm.
familiar with him, a German theologian who was executed in Nazi Germany for plotting an assassination attempt on Hitler.
Jeez.
His Lutheran pastor, man, that's die hard right there.
Woof.
Um, but he talks about the cheap grace,
Yeah.
and we don't in the church where if we're not careful, we'll tell people that following Jesus is easy. No,
Mhm.
it's not. And in fact, nowhere does Jesus say that if you follow me, you're not going to suffer. Nowhere does Jesus say if you follow me, there won't be a cancer diagnosis.
Mhm.
Another dear friend of mine who loves Jesus is facing stage 4 prostate cancer.
Mhm.
And he and his family and wife are so gracious and so trusting, but that doesn't mean it's easy.
Mhm.
And again, that speaks to the maturity of his faith. Now, someone who's new in faith, I would understand why they would struggle in their faith. So let's be. This is not a shame thing. If somebody's
No.
got a cancer diagnosis and they're wrestling with God,
No, none of this is coming from a shame point because it's something that we're all really bad at.
yeah, and you see people like I've had friends that when they're facing it, they're still like, God is good. I love the Lord. I don't understand. I'm struggling, and that doesn't mean they don't have bad days. That doesn't even mean that there aren't days that they're not like, where are you, God? Why, God?
I really do keep thinking about your belaying example that you put at the beginning of this podcast. Okay, so experienced or otherwise, cliff climbing and getting down there takes physical exertion.
Yep.
Right? It's hard.
You can't just do it.
You can't just do it. But both of those individuals, beginner or experienced, have a faith in their protective equipment, right? They have a faith in the belayer. They have a faith.
Hopefully they do.
Hopefully they do. But you said the hardest part for that new person is just that stepping over into faith, right?
Yeah.
Stepping and no longer leaning on your own strength or understanding, but now giving yourself over completely to this system,
Yeah.
right? And so I find that both of those individuals, no matter what, once they put their faith in that, it takes effort, but it's a future hope for that if and when something goes
Yeah.
wrong,
That's good.
it is there for them. It's a future hope, which is so hard to hold on to in the moment.
Yep. And it's a future hope grounded in what we know to be true about God.
About God, yeah.
And even in that, like, we don't have a blind faith.
Mm-mm.
We don't have an unreasonable faith. We have a reasonable faith based upon the evidence of the resurrection, based upon what we know of the gospel. And it's still there's still an element of faith.
Yes.
To believe in the resurrection still requires faith, because
Yes.
if I could prove the only way I could prove the resurrection is either to go back in time,
Yep.
or somehow prove that Jesus was risen from the grave with absolute proof. Well, it wouldn't be faith anymore.
Yeah.
Because in order for it to be faith, there has to be an element of which I cannot see it,
Mhm.
right? Let's tie the proverbial knot or bow together.
Mm-hmm.
I think the reason why I wanted to talk about these is because life is hard at times.
Mm-hmm.
Things can get rough. Sometimes people go through unnecessary struggles, unnecessary trials.
Mm-hmm.
First thing, our job as friends, particularly if we're brothers and sisters in Christ, don't try and offer up reasons or explain it. Just be with them in it.
Yeah.
And if they're trying to sustain, offer encouragement.
Mm.
And sometimes, here's one of the encouragements that I do when I know people who are dealing with things and they're upset. I'll say this regularly. It's okay if you're upset with God.
Yeah.
God can handle it.
Yeah.
In fact, what we'll find in the book of Job is that Job gets upset with God.
Yeah.
And God calls Job out on it, but he didn't call Job out because he was upset. He's just reminding Job, you don't know, no matter how much you think you understand, you are not God.
Mm.
And so I'll tell people, it's okay to be angry with God. God can handle your anger.
Mm-hmm.
When my kids get angry with me, it doesn't affect my love for them.
Yeah.
Because I'm older than they are, I'm bigger than they are, but I also love them as a parent. How much more does God us? And sometimes we feel like it's a sin to be angry with God. No, anger is a human emotion. If you're human, my spiritual director said this, if you're human, you're angry.
Yep.
And so if you're seeing somebody who's going through something difficult, and maybe it's a trauma, and they're like, I don't understand why this is happening. Don't try and explain why it's happening, especially try and blaming, well, it happened because of this, this, or this.
Yeah.
Even if there's actual reasons why you know it happened.
Yeah.
When somebody's actually in the middle of grief, the best thing you can do is just be present.
Right.
Right? Now, if they're in sin and they're blaming God because of their own sin. Well, in love, you gently correct them
Yes.
and you speak truth in love and say, "Hey, wait, it's the alcoholic who's upset that they got a DUI and goes, 'Where were you, Lord?' Well, he was probably
Well,
with you at the bar saying, 'Don't have another
yeah,
drink.'"
don't do this. Yeah.
Right? And you can't
Or
blame God
or
for that.
with you in your friends telling you to seek help or
That's
something
right.
like that.
Any
You know,
number of
like any
things.
number of things.
And you chose. Free will gives you choice. Sometimes you're going to experience trials, and I think as Christians, what we consider persecution is so not persecution. When I was in high school, I thought I was being persecuted because people didn't like that I wore my Jesus T-shirts,
Yeah.
and I was like, "Oh, I'm being persecuted for my faith,"
Uh,
and I was like, "That's right, I'm bold, taking a stand for Jesus."
and all of the Christian missionaries in China,
Yeah.
they cringe.
And so there are times where we can correct somebody,
Yeah.
but when somebody's really going through it,
Yeah.
even when somebody's really going through hard things and they don't understand, Paul had a maturity, but Paul didn't just get mature. Paul had a long time in which God worked and grew in him.
Yeah.
And we have to have patience with people. And we have to realize that, especially if someone is new in faith and then things happen, instead of going, "Well, you obviously just need to have more faith in Jesus," it's okay to say, "You know what? I get it. It must be really confusing. You just became a Christian and now all of a sudden you lose your job."
Mm-hmm.
And here's what we're going to do: we're going to pray. And part of the body of Christ is we hear that and it's okay. But I don't think God caused this. Maybe he did. I'm not God, but don't let this deter your faith. And instead of shaming them for their immaturity, let's recognize that immaturity exists for a reason, because that's an area we just haven't grown up yet.
Yeah.
And we all have those things. Then the other side is for us who are in the suffering. It's okay to express wholeheartedly what is going on inside of us, to express our fears, our angers, our frustrations, and know that God's not mad at us, that God can handle it. Hold on, I need to check something real quick. But also, this is the experience that all of us are going to have. This side of heaven, you might have a perfect life right now.
Mm.
You might have 2.5 kids, the beautiful house, the perfect job, the bank account, retirement, everything's set up.
Mm-hmm.
And all it takes is an instant, and everything can change.
Mm-hmm.
All it takes is one turn of the market, and you lose all your money.
Sure.
And God is still faithful regardless, because God never promised this side of eternity that we would not go through hard times.
Yeah.
Our job is to be present as friends in hard times, to care for one another, but also to speak truth and encourage and exhort one another in those times of difficulty.
Yeah.
And then the last thing, and this is what I love about the surfer, sometimes we're so busy fighting for our rights that we miss the opportunity to share the gospel on an even bigger stage.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes what the suffering is when it feels like persecution. Sometimes God puts us in those or allows those situations. And the mature thing to do is, instead of fighting for my right, Paul didn't fight for his right to go free. He fought for his right to stay in jail. That's weird, man.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but he saw his imprisonment as an asset.
He saw it as it was a resource. He saw his prison term as a resource. He saw his rights as a Roman citizen to go before the magistrate and the governor all the way up to Caesar. He saw it all as an opportunity. He saw his rights. Our American rights are a resource. They become an asset when we use them for the kingdom of God.
Correct.
Not for our rights or our church's rights, but the right to share Jesus in a powerful way.
Yeah. Man. Good stuff.
Dude, we kind of went all over today.
No, man, but it all comes together
It
eventually.
does.
People just have to sit in for an hour to figure out what the actual what the message is. No, man, but hey, thanks for another great podcast. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, brother.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Pocket Theology. If you want to send suggestions for topics, feedback on the podcast, or just your general thoughts and insights, feel free to email us at podcast@zionclearlake.org to get in touch. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, please like, comment, and share the episode with others. This really helps us out as we continue to spread encouraging messages rooted in practical theology and discussion of Scripture. Thanks, and we'll see you again next week.